from the world of politics.
I really do hope that President Trump sees the writing on the wall. And I'd like to think that the Republican Party is ready to move on from somebody who's been, for this party, a three-time loser.
To the world of business.
The Bank of England is talking about 2-year recession. I think that's probably a bit overcooked. We're going to have some pain.
This is Balance of Power with David Weston.
From Bloomberg Studios in London to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. We begin once again today in Bali, of course, in Indonesia, where they are having those G20 meetings, getting ever closer to, we assume, is going to be some sort of joint communique. For a report on what is going on today in Bali, we turn now to our Washington correspondent, Anne-Marie Hordern, who is reporting from there as she travels with the president. So, Anne-Marie, what happened today?
Well, David, it does look like they were able to agree, at least on the Sherpa level, of what is going on in terms of this communique. And this was always going to be a very difficult moment for this G20, given the fact that Russia is a member of the group. But it does seem like language was to be agreed upon. We heard from German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. He says more countries are willing to condemn the war. And then we heard from the president's deputy national security advisor, Mike Pyle, speaking to me earlier this evening in Bali, talking about the fact that more countries he sees, and he's the Sherpa, want to come out and condemn Russia's aggression against Ukraine. We have to, of course, wait for the leaders to sign this, David, but this also comes as a really critical and a moment that almost juxtaposes what's going on here in words to what's going on the ground in Ukraine. And we heard from Jake Sullivan, President's National Security Advisor, come out, and he's here in Bali, and discuss what is happening this evening, and that is more missiles hitting Kyiv and residential areas in Kyiv. So today was really all about talking about what's going on, and not just what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, but also the implications this has for things like energy security and food security. And on food security, a really important date was coming up, and that was November 19th. That's this weekend, and that's when that Black Sea grain deal was set to expire. And Bloomberg has a scoop that it does look like the Russians are going to sign up to extend that deal. So for vulnerable countries around the world that are dealing with higher inflation, higher food prices, this is a really big moment.
Okay, thank you so very much to Anne-Marie Hordern for your continued reporting from Bali, Indonesia. We now welcome somebody who's a veteran of these sorts of G20s. He is Sir Peter Westmacott, a lifelong diplomat for the United Kingdom, and he is now chairman of scroll it through. Why don't you tell us, Sir Peter, what you're chairman of?
Well, I'm chairman of TKO Capital UK, which is the UK branch of a French alternative asset management firm.
That's great. Thank you. So welcome. It's great to have you here. Let's pick up where Anne-Marie left off. She said she had some discussions over there with Mike Pyle, who's the Deputy National Security Advisor, and this is what he had to say to her.
I think what you'll see in the communique when it's released is that most of the G20 came together to strongly condemn Russia's war, to strongly condemn those actions and the consequences that's had for the global economy. And you're also going to see reflected in that a lot of the priorities that the president's articulated.
So, Sir Peter Westmacott, what do you make of that statement? It would be quite a breakthrough, I take it, if there was a joint communique in actually where 19 countries, presumably not Russia, agreed in condemning this invasion of Ukraine.
I think it would be a remarkable achievement, David, if we got that far, because as we know, 40% of the world's population live in countries which have not condemned the invasion of Ukraine, and that includes India, it includes China, it includes much of the Arab world, parts of Latin America. So to get that far, I think would be remarkable. And we still await a proper readout of how President Macron and Xi Jinping got on their bilateral earlier today. There have been some hints out of the Elysee that maybe China's gone back to its old position of calling for full respect of the territorial sovereignty of Ukraine. If that were true, that would be important because that is where China used to be, but we're not quite sure what's going on. But I think that if we got the vast majority of the G20 participants signing on for that, that is very significant. And it is also potentially some real pressure on Vladimir Putin to start thinking again where he goes from here, given that his initial military adventure has demonstrably failed.
So talk about President Xi specifically, because yesterday we had that meeting, that very long meeting between President Biden and President Xi. We had readouts from both sides. We obviously know Russia is not president of the G20, but is it possible one of the effects of this G20 is bringing China a little bit back into the fold?
I think that might be one of the outcomes. We know that President Biden and Xi Jinping go back a very long way. You know, they've spent hours and hours together. It was President Biden, who was then the vice president, who escorted him around the United States for weeks, actually, when he was the number 2. So the fact that that meeting overran and they spent 3 hours talking to each other, even allowing for interpretation, and I think that the tone that we heard from the president was pretty upbeat, not unrealistically so, but pretty upbeat. I think there's a chance there of China beginning to conclude, you know what, this adventure is not really in our interests. Do we want to be appear to be supportive of the continuing slaughter of people and destruction of Ukraine, which isn't working, given the damage it's also doing to China's global economic interests, never mind poverty in Africa because of the shortage of grain and the prices of fuel and so on. So I think it could be important. Of course, one of the risks that we've got is that China and Russia, if this is mishandled, end up being even more closely drawn together. But at the moment, it looks as though a little bit of daylight might be beginning to appear between those two.
So, Peter, you were ambassador not only to Turkey and France, but also the United States, of course. And since we're here in London, I'm curious about the view of the midterm elections from here, from the United Kingdom and Europe. How does it look from over here?
I would say that there was perhaps a sigh of relief, because a lot of us had looked at independent commentators in the United States who were saying not just, well, you know, the Democrats might not do very well, there might be the red wave and so on. It was more significant than that. A lot of independent commentators were telling us democracy in America is on the line. And so I think some people were concerned that some of those election deniers were going to get elected, and that if there was a clean sweep of both houses in Congress, of the Senate and the House, that, you know, who knows what happens in the future in terms of election not being respected and votes not being counted in the normal way. What we've seen is the best performance by a Democratic president in 4 decades, an incumbent one. His own party did not get blown away. They have held the Senate, might even have increased their showing and get a tiny majority. The House, we don't know. I think it's a long shot, but who knows? But I think overall, the sense from abroad is that the president has not done nearly as badly as he might have done, that this is a little bit of a kick up the backside for President Trump, former President Trump. And there's a question now as to whether he really will run for the Republican nomination for 2024, and none of us knows the outcome. We might learn later today,
exactly,
but we might not.
Yeah, exactly. 9 o'clock Eastern Time is giving some sort of remarks. The other, we are here in the United Kingdom, and there are a fair number of challenges here as well. Certainly, the economy is a challenge. We had a little kerfuffle with the mini budget. Now there's a different budget. We're going to get a new budget, as I understand it, on Thursday. Give us your sense of the UK economy. What are the challenges that it faces?
Well, we have had a kerfuffle. We've had a political and an economic one. We got 4 new prime ministers in 5 years, and none of them had actually been elected by the British people at the time, so it's a little strange. Not quite the way we normally change governments here. And then we did have the famous mini budget, which sent the markets into a tailspin with a lot of collateral damage, short-term anyway, for pension funds and other investors, and interest rates. So I think what we're going to see is a very conservative attempt by the current Chancellor and, of course, his predecessor but one, Rishi Sunak, who also knows how the Treasury works and also has a good understanding of public finances, which will be designed to stabilize the finances, restore confidence in the management of the UK, restore financial stability to a centre which is, after all, one of the most important international financial centres, and find some way of threading that very difficult needle of reducing some of the expenditure, but also raising some of the income without having voters suffer more than they have to.
To what extent is the UK going to have to do it on its own, post-Brexit? To what extent can there be more cooperation with Europe? Even now, we're hearing about an agreement between France and the UK, for example, on immigration. I mean, you have a problem maybe a little similar to what we have on the southern border of people coming across the channel.
Economically, it's going to be difficult. We've left the single market. We've left the customs union. There's 15% down in UK's trade with the rest of Europe. And we're going to have a higher level of inflation next year than the rest of Europe. So I think the economic damage from Brexit is out there, and we haven't yet got any sign of the promised sunlit uplands. So we've got to be realistic about that. But we won't have to do it entirely on our own. What I'm pleased about is that the new government has realised that rather than, if you like, calling people rude names, the answer for UK national interest is to develop proper, functioning, courteous useful relationships with our other European partners. And so there's a rebuilding of trust and confidence, even friendship, between London and Paris, which I think is essential. And it's essential also to deal with that problem you've just raised, which is that politically here in the UK, the number of people, 40,000 in the last year, coming across the channel in risky little inflatable boats has gone through the roof. And this is politically a big hot potato, and we cannot fix that problem without cooperation from our French friends and neighbours. Of course, there's a whole lot of other considerations, including the way in which we deal with asylum applicants here in the UK. But working closely with the French on that, as well as on European security, Britain and France are the two significant European defence players, and on foreign policy, including the crisis in Ukraine and so on. This is something that the new government, I think, has grasped, that we have no choice but to build better relationships, even after Brexit, with our European partners.
Sir Peter, so great to have you here on the set here in London. That's Sir Peter Westmacott. He is the chairman of Tikal Capital UK. Coming up, in the wake of the midterm elections, we'll talk with the man who ran the campaign for the Republicans in the Senate. He's Senator Rick Scott of Florida. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David West. We had those midterm elections in the United States last week, and we don't fully know all the results yet. We do know that the Democrats will hold at least 50 seats in the Senate. It's not clear what will happen with the 51st, given the runoff that's coming up. In the meantime, it looks like the Republicans will have a narrow majority in the House, although that's not fully determined yet either. We turn to now somebody who was really instrumental in running the effort for the Republicans. He's Republican Senator Rick Scott of Florida. So, Senator, thank you so much for being with us. However you characterize this, it didn't come out as well as I think you hoped it would come out. And so I guess my question is, why? Looking back over it, was it the candidates, the quality of the candidates? Was it the issues? Was it a combination of the two?
Well, David, yeah, it didn't come out the way we thought. We had great candidates. We had wonderful candidates, actually. They worked really hard. Unfortunately, the intensity was not there with our voters. And so I think one thing we're going to do is we're going to take a look at why that was and understand what we have to do. I think it's clear that we have to have a very positive agenda, what we're going to do, and we've got to stand up for what Republicans, campaign on. We got to govern that way. So, that's what my plan is, make sure we have a positive message. I'm still making sure we're going to win Georgia. Herschel Walker is a great candidate. I've been down there campaigning with him. I was down there Sunday and Monday campaigning with him. He's getting big crowds. So we're raising money. We're getting the message out. We're continuing to explain that Warnock is somebody that has voted basically for all this spending that causes inflation, has voted against border security, is not supportive of law enforcement. Those are not positive things for Georgia. So we're going to do everything we can to make sure Herschel is the new senator from Georgia.
So you say you didn't have the enthusiasm that you would have liked among your voters. How much of that had to do with some of the issues? And I'll name two of them. Abortion, which seems to have actually, if anything, cut against Republicans. And the other is some of the so-called election denial. It appears that people didn't really buy that argument.
Well, I think that, you can see that Americans are saying the country's on the wrong track. So for whatever reason, they said the country's on the wrong track, but they didn't come out in the way we thought they would for Republicans. So I think what we have to look at and say, what do we need to do up here to make sure that people understand that we're going to be the ones that we have the ideas to get rid of inflation, to take care of our law enforcement, to secure the border, to make sure we have a strong military. I think that's what we do every day.
So do you have the right leadership? I mean, you're going to have a vote on the leadership in the Senate here, and there's some talk that maybe it's time, no criticism anybody's there now, but it's time to have a new team in place. Is there a chance that, in fact, Mitch McConnell may not get to be the minority leader?
Well, I think we ought to be delaying the election. Their plan is to hold the election tomorrow, and we still don't know who the Republican senator is going to be from Alaska, or if we're going to have a Republican senator from Georgia. So I think it makes sense to delay the vote until after we know the results of all these elections. The Democrats have already done that. And so that's what I've been pushing. We'll see if that happens. And then we'll see if somebody runs against the current leader. And then if they do, see if they're able to garner a majority of the votes.
So forgive me, but I handicapped that question about the delay a bit. I had read that you were supporting a delay in it. What are the chances that will happen?
I know we're going to talk about it at lunch today. Lunch starts about 1 o'clock. We're going to have a conversation about that today, and then we'll see. I think it makes all the sense in the world to delay this until we know the result of Alaska and the result of Georgia, and then we give people time. If somebody, give people time to have a real conversation about why we didn't get a majority. When 70% of Americans think the country's on the wrong track, what do we have to do to make sure there's energy on our side, that we have a positive message that people want to say, I'm going to go out there and work my butt off to make sure Republicans get elected because they're going to do these things.
Before we even get to the new Congress, there's some work perhaps to be done yet this year, certainly in funding the government, perhaps on the debt ceiling. Are you open to a lift of the debt ceiling in the lame duck?
Well, I think that first off, right now, the government is funded through December 16th, so we'll have to do a continuing resolution after that. I think it needs to be a clean resolution. I think we ought to go to the next Congress and let them make choices. We had an election of how we're going to spend our money. I think we've got to balance our budget. With regard to the debt ceiling, my belief is that we shouldn't be raising the debt ceiling unless we're going to do structural change. We're going to cut costs or come up with some structural change to stop this. We've got $31 trillion worth of debt. This ridiculous spending and these deficits are causing this inflation that's hurting families. David, I grew up in a very poor family. I watched my mom struggle with inflation. That's happening all across my state. I got people going to food banks that have never gone to a food bank, postponing their retirement or coming out of retirement because they can't afford to live right now. We got to stop this gas prices going up and food prices going up, and it's all caused because of regulations and the attitude of the federal government that's making it cost of things to go up.
You've been consistent on that point, Senator, for a while, and you're not alone on it. Don't misunderstand me. Various people talk about more responsible spending. At the same time, are you willing to walk up to and perhaps even over the line if defaulting?
I don't think we should ever default. But I think everybody's got to take this seriously. We got to say, we just had an election. We know the American public is mad about where the country is. So let's both, I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat, you ought to come together and say, what are we going to get to get gas prices down? You've got to drill safely in this country. That's one thing you have to do. Number two, we've got to get food prices down. Part of that's caused by energy prices, but we've got to get our government, our spending in order. I mean, we're raising unbelievable amounts of money right now in this country, and we got to control spending. If you care about any program, if you care about having a strong military, if you care about having a Medicare program that's funded or a Social Security program, then you know you have to live within your means.
And finally, Senator, there's something else happening today in the Republican Party, not just your lunch. You're talking about the leadership, and that is going to be former President Trump speaking at 9 p.m. Eastern time down at Mar-a-Lago. We actually talked with Ken Griffin over in Singapore about President Trump and his prospects. This is part of what he had to say.
He lost in 2020. We lost Georgia because of his behavior in the Senate race in 2020. That's a second loss. And then this year, the Republicans lost the Senate because the Trump-backed candidates in the Senate races were rejected by American voters. That's a three-time loser. And I'd like to think that the Republican Party is ready to move on from somebody who's been, for this party, a three-time loser.
So Ken Griffin, who now, as I recall, lives in Florida, thinks it's time to move on. Does Senator Scott think it's time to move on? I mean, for example, if Donald Trump said he wants to run and Rick DeSantis said he wanted to run, would you endorse either one?
Well, first off, I'm focused on making sure we win Georgia. I'm focused on making sure that we solve the problems up here. I mean, I think it looks like there's going to be a lot of people interested in running in 2024. I don't know if President Trump will announce today he's running, but it seems like a lot of people will watch it as it happens. But, my belief is voters are going to choose. They're going to choose to get somebody to run for president on our side that's going to solve the problems of the day. And so we'll see who has the best ideas.
Okay, Senator, really appreciate your coming. As I say, you've had a long, hard run here, so it's good of you to spend some time with us. That's Republican Senator Rick Scott of Florida. Coming up later, we're going to get to talk with Democratic Congresswoman Haley Stevens from Michigan. And this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
Global inflation and recession, an energy crisis intensified by war, and the aftermath of a pandemic. Today, world leaders are meeting in Bali for the G20 summit, And Bloomberg is there bringing you the news and analysis.
A confluence of economic, climate, and security crises make it a uniquely challenging time.
All of these are pointing towards a big slowdown in trade.
It all starts today, only on Bloomberg, your global news authority.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's time we check in on the markets here, and we're joined now by Kriti Gupta. So, Kriti, tell us about what the markets are doing. I guess PPI has something to do with it.
Well, green on the screen, and it's interesting, David. A lot of people are going to peg the move just to the PPI numbers that came in much lighter than expected, essentially really confirming this idea that we heard from the CPI report last week that inflation is moderating faster than we expected. And by we, I mean the markets, of course. But the market was already up about 1% even before that PPI data hit. So now you're looking at a stock market rally to the tune of 1.3%, really led by those big tech names. NASDAQ outperforming 2.3%. But, David, it's that PPI number that is kind of creating a little bit of reassurance into the market. And remember, we've gone into this environment that follows the midterms. You are now, I believe, we're still waiting on the call for the House, but it looks like gridlock at the moment, which of course we know is a positive for the market. So there's a few things that are kind of working in the bulls' favor right now.
Okay, so that's fascinating. What's going on with the bond market?
Well, the bond market, you are still seeing yields lower. I'm looking at 381 on the 10-year yield. That's really only a move about 4 basis points. What's interesting to me, though, is that the bond market is perhaps still waiting for that stalled terminal rate. That volatility that we saw in the last couple of weeks, it really isn't quite there yet. And to see a 4 basis point move lower on the 10-year yield off the back of some moderating PPI data tells you that perhaps bond traders are waiting then for not just the next move from the Federal Reserve, but bracing themselves for this talk of a step down. And that's going to be really crucial, feeding back into the story for the stock market. For our TV audience, you're looking at a chart right now of the technicals. For our radio audience, stick with me here. The S&P 500, it's crossed its 50-day, it's crossed its 100-day. I think a lot of people are saying, well, perhaps as the bond market stalls out, the stock market has a reason to rally again.
And finally, I think we also had some company news, don't we? We had some Walmart news and I guess some Home Depot as well.
Some of the major movers actually this morning. Let's start with the Walmart and Home Depot story. Essentially, this retail theme that we've been talking about, perhaps waiting for the consumer to really slow down. But Walmart and Home Depot both beating their sales numbers, both beating their profit story. Inventory is where they diverge. Walmart cutting their inventory rise in half. Home Depot still working on that buildup. So that's really where you're seeing the stock market react a little bit. Walmart shares up about 5% in the market. Home Depot shares, on the other hand, actually down 0.8% despite beating their earnings. Tells you inventory is all the focus there.
Okay, Kriti, thank you so very much. That's Kriti Gupta, and you can catch Kriti again at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, when she'll be anchoring Bloomberg Markets. Coming up, we're going to talk with the former ECB head, Jean-Claude Trichet. He's going to take us through the state of the European economy and how ECB monetary policy should respond to a tightening Fed. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David West, and we want to keep you up to date on news from all around the world. From that, we turn to Mark Crumpton here with the first word.
David, thank you. It's another sign that inflationary pressures in the United States are starting to ease. The producer price index rose 8% in October from a year ago. That's the smallest annual gain in a year. The monthly gain was 0.2%, half of what economists were expecting. Former President Trump is set to announce he's running for the White House again. The announcement will come tonight at his Mar-a-Lago club in Florida. But Citadel's billionaire founder Ken Griffin thinks Republicans should look elsewhere.
He lost in 2020. We lost Georgia because of his behavior in the Senate race in 2020. That's a second loss. And then this year, the Republicans lost the Senate because the Trump-backed candidates in the Senate races were rejected by American voters. That's a 3-time loser. And I'd like to think that the Republican Party is ready to move on from somebody who's been, for this party, a 3-time loser.
Griffin supports Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. He spoke at the Bloomberg New Economy Forum in Singapore. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has laid out his demands for peace talks. In an address to the G20 summit in Bali, Zelensky said Russia must first accept his country's border and withdraw its troops. According to a draft statement seen by Bloomberg, most G20 nations were set to condemn the Russian invasion. NASA is hoping the third time really will be the charm. Early Wednesday, the space agency will try for a third time to get the Artemis 1 unmanned moon mission off the ground. It will be the debut of NASA's massive new rocket, the Space Launch System. The previous missions have been delayed by technical glitches and uncooperative weather. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, besides the tug and pull of leadership in the House and the Senate among Republicans and Democrats, we also have another big item on the political agenda for today, and that is 9 p.m. tonight Eastern Time. We're going to have former President Trump make a major address, he says, in Mar-a-Lago. To give us a preview of what we think is in that address and why, welcome now Bloomberg Politics editor Mario Parker. Mario, thanks so much for being here. So I guess it's a pretty ill-kept secret, but is there any doubt about what President Trump is going to say?
No, there's not much doubt at all as to what he's going to say. Our sources are telling us that he's full steam ahead on the announcement that he teased a week or so ago on the eve of the midterm election. So all indications are, unless something changes, that he's going to announce a third White House bid later on this evening at 9 p.m.
What do other Republican leadership think about this? Do we know? Do we have some reporting on what other leaders in the party are saying?
Well, yes, absolutely. I mean, this is Donald Trump is at his lowest point, his weakest point politically since the immediate aftermath of the January 6th riots on the U.S. Capitol. He sought to tighten his grip on the GOP throughout the midterm cycle, elevating and endorsing candidates all across the ballot, and they underwhelmed very, very badly, actually. And so now this announcement comes as many Republicans are rare public criticism toward the former president, agitating for him to either delay the announcement and or just pass the torch to someone like Florida Governor Ron DeSantis.
Well, so pick up on that specific point, Mario, if you would. There was a time when I think it might be thought that President Trump making an announcement might freeze other potential candidates out. Is that still the case, for example, Ron DeSantis, or for that matter, Mike Pence, or any number of other potential candidates? By the way, Chris Christie seems to be talking about it.
Yeah, no, very astute observation. No, there's, I mean, he's wounded. There's no question about that on the heels of last week's or this past week's lackluster midterm showing. He's taken a lot of the blame for that. And so the opening salvo to freeze the competition that he envisioned for this announcement to make, that's not going to be the case. I mean, just a few minutes ago, you saw Ron DeSantis, he held a press conference where he said that, that he was asked about the former president's attacks on him, and he said, essentially, check the scorecard for last week. That's one of his most forceful responses yet. Mike Pence is set to release his book today. He's going on a press around his book as well, where he's speaking about January 6th and the like. So no, this isn't going to freeze the competition at all.
At the same time, given all the difficulties that President Trump has, and of course we don't have polls on this necessarily that are up to date, might he not still be the favorite among Republicans right now? He still has a fair amount of support, does he not?
And that's the caveat, right? So even a weakened former President Trump is still, as of right now, the presumptive frontrunner for the GOP nomination. Ron DeSantis, at least some of the polls that we're seeing in recent days, while he's surging, I mean, he has a lot of ground to make up in order to supersede the former president among the GOP base. So as of right now, again, as you mentioned, he is still the presumptive frontrunner, and it looks like whoever wants the nomination is going to have to go through him.
Okay, thank you so much. That's our politics editor here at Bloomberg. He is Mario Parker. Coming up, we're going to talk with former ECB head Jean-Claude Trichet about the state of the European economy and monetary policy by the ECB. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We're here in London, where we're going to get a new budget for the UK government coming up on Thursday. In the meantime, yesterday we heard from the Vice Chair of the Fed, Leo Brainerd, about maybe plans of the Fed about what they're going to do with tightening. So that leaves, of course, Europe. What is going on in Europe with the economy, also with its monetary policy? For that, we turn to Jean-Claude Trichet. He is chair of the Trilateral Commission. Mr. Trichet earlier served as president of the European Central Bank and also as governor of the Bank of France. So thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it. Give us your sense in a nutshell of where the European economy is now. How difficult is the situation in Europe, on the continent?
I think the European economy and the Eurozone, but the European Union as a whole, are more or less in the same situation, namely a year that has been reasonably good as an average this year, but will slow down considerably next year. And so all forecasts are indicating that this is the way the real economy will move. And I have to mention something which is important in terms of comparing the US and Europe. It's clear that Europe is more, I would say, badly hit by the situation in Ukraine, by the situation of commodities, oil, gas, and the prices. And I take it really, when I compare the headline inflation and compare headline inflation with core inflation. In the US, headline inflation is, at the moment, I think in October, 7.7. And in Europe, in the euro area, it's 10.7. So a big difference of 3%. When core inflation is the same on both sides of the Atlantic, around 6.3, 6.4%. So you see the difference of 3%, 10.7 minus 7.7, 3%, means that the European economy is touched by the increase of the prices of oil, gas, and agro products much more than the US, which of course signals that the damage which is done to the real economy is higher, will be higher next year in Europe than is in the United States of America, even if the US also will slow down, of course. So that's a very important point, which we must have in mind when we compare the policies and the situation on both sides of the Atlantic.
So explain to me, as a central banker, how you take into account that distinction between headline and core, because I had heard in the past central bankers tend to focus on core more because that is more stable, that there's more volatility when it comes to food and energy. But given the situation in energy right now, should we be expecting that Europe will have a real problem with energy prices going out in the future some way?
Well, the central banks are not responsible for the price of oil, of commodities in general, and any oil shock or commodity shock cannot be corrected by the central bank. That goes without saying. The central bank is responsible for what I would call the second round effects. The fact that precisely those prices that are augmenting very, very dramatically are or not polluting all other prices. And there, of course, core inflation is very important. This core inflation is all the prices without those that are commodity prices and energy prices increases and so forth. So I would say on both sides of the Atlantic, the central bank have to concentrate on preventing the second round effects. And they are starting from the same point because, again, we have the same core inflation in the US and in Europe, 6.3, 6.4. That being said, of course, in Europe, the central banks sees that the real economy is, as I said, more badly hit by these increases of prices of commodities, oil and gas and so forth, than is the case in the US. So the European Central Bank has to take that into account when it, I would say, designed its monetary policy. Part of its job is done, if I may, by the weakening of the real economy, the weakening of demand, which comes out of the headline inflation. So all taken into account, I'm not surprised that the Euro Central Bank, the Euro area Central Bank, is a little bit more cautious than the United States, because again, part of the job of the ECB is done by this very, very damaging, I would say, impact on the real economy by war in Ukraine and all what goes with this commodity increases prices.
So, Mr. Trichet, let me pick up on that point exactly. As you compare Europe on the one hand with the U.S. on the other hand, in the U.S. now there are some indications, it's too soon to tell for sure, that maybe inflation is peaking. We've heard from, for example, Lael Brainerd, the vice chair, just yesterday saying maybe they'll be able to slow down, maybe the rate of increases. Is it possible, in fact, that the prospects of recession in Europe actually will have something of the same effect? Should the ECB be slowing down in its tightening?
No, I don't think that the ECB should slow down personally. Of course, I make absolutely no forecast of any kind. The Governing Council will see what to do. But it's clear, nevertheless, that we have a level of core inflation, same as in the US, which is very high. And the combination of the core inflation high is very dangerous in terms of second round effects that would continue to go on. So the credibility of the central bank, and it is the same on both sides of the Atlantic, but particularly I have to say in Europe, the credibility of the central bank is absolutely key because it has to convince all price setters that any kind of assumption on a spiraling of prices and cost would be very, very damaging and not in line with the goal of the central bank, which is to deliver 2% in the medium term, say in 3 years, to oversimplify. By the way, it is very, very important to underline that on both sides of the Atlantic, the objective is the same. 2% in a 3 years' time, say in a medium term, is the goal which has been reaffirmed by Jay Powell on the one hand and Christine Lagarde on the other hand. Both have the same objective. Both have the same definition of price stability, if you wish. That being said, of course, the situations are not the same. I would say, overall, as I mentioned, hit on the real economy is not the same on both sides of the Atlantic. I could add that demand has been very, very strongly pushed up by the fiscal policy in the United States of America, a stronger push-up than in Europe. That being said, all taken into account, both central banks have to take into account absolutely all elements that are at stake, including the exchange rate, because at the moment we are speaking, the US economy is importing disinflation, and the European economy is importing some inflation through the exchange rate mechanism.
Mr. Trichet, it's always so helpful to have you with us. Thank you so much for your time. That's Jean-Claude Trichet, former president of the European Central Bank. Coming up, we're going to talk to one of the victors in last week's midterm elections. She's Democratic Congresswoman Haley Stevens of Michigan. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We had those midterm elections last week, and we now know that the Democrats will hold the Senate one way or the other. It's not clear what happened in the House, although it looks like it may well go narrowly for the Republicans. But one place that the Democrats did a lot better than anybody thought was in the state of Michigan, my home state. Welcome now, Democratic Congresswoman from Michigan. She is Haley Stevens. So first of all, congratulations, Congresswoman, on your victory. Explain what happened in the water winter wonderland out there in Michigan, because, boy, the Democrats had a good night, including with the constitutional amendment.
Well, absolutely. And David, as you were talking about the Democrats holding control of the Senate, don't forget that Senator Gary Peters from Michigan was the one who led the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee to that incredible victory. But very specific to our state, Democratic women in particular had a phenomenal evening on Tuesday. Pro-choice women had a phenomenal evening, re-electing Governor Gretchen Whitmer, who's been a champion for infrastructure, semiconductors, our workforce, investments in education, kitchen table issues. Democracy won that evening, re-electing our Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benson, and our Attorney General, Dana Nessel. And then for the first time ever, really, in the last 40 years, we now have a Democratic Senate in our state capital in Lansing. as well as a Democratic House majority in Michigan. And so what you're going to see coming out of Michigan, and I would encourage everyone to look at this, continued economic development efforts, investments in our schools, sort of righting the ship of the underinvestment that took place over years under Betsy DeVos-funded leadership in Michigan, as well as gun safety legislation. We're just about at the year anniversary of the horrific Oxford High School shooting that took place. There are threats happening every single day, unfortunately, in Oakland County, Michigan, and we need to right that ship. And so we know that this newly elected majority in our state capitol, working alongside our proven, tough fighter of a governor, is going to get it done.
So one question I think on all our minds is, where does the Democratic go next? And let's talk about the House specifically. We don't know yet who has the majority. It looks like Republicans might have a narrow majority. Will that make a difference in deciding who leads you forward? I know Nancy Pelosi is the Speaker of the House. She's been there a good long time. I know you think she's done a great job. At the same time, there always comes a time to move on. Is it time for her to move on?
Well, look, we are in a wait-and-see period. Certainly, the final votes are coming through for House seats in Michigan, or around the country. We know Michigan's results. We reelected our Democratic majority. Dan Kilde's coming back, Alyssa Slotkin. But then the other deal, David, here is that if we end up in the minority, it's going to be a slim minority. And I am in the Problem Solvers Caucus, right, comprised of 29 Democrats, 29 Republicans, bipartisan initiatives. We've got to look in this new Congress on energy issues, so ongoing supply chain disruption issues, workforce development, certainly, how we maintain access to commodities. This is something that I hear from every single day from manufacturers all over my home state, but certainly in the Midwest. And so as we think about our new dynamic here in Washington, we know that we're going to have President Biden leading the charge, working alongside the legislature as it comes out. But the reality is the votes get tallied, the votes come down, and we're going to have a House majority one way or another. That is either Democrat or Republican.
And as you say, it's going to be narrow no matter what it is. I mean, really remarkably narrow given the situation historically. So let's assume you get a narrow minority. What's the first call you make across the aisle? If in fact you're not just going to be the party of no, say try to block everything, you're trying to do something affirmatively, what's the first thing you want to pick that you think you might get done?
Well, and David, I think if you think about this last election and really reflect on what we've heard from the American people, is that they like good government. They like government that is working for them. They like government that is adhering to the taxpayer considerations. And so when we think about some of the ongoing challenges as we head into the quarter 21st century in the 118th Congress, we've got to be thinking about workforce development. We've got to be planning for immigration reform, meeting the needs that our employers are facing with workforce shortages, and then also coming up with an energy plan for this country. Those are all bipartisan things. If you talk about manufacturing and innovation, that's what brings people together. We still got that work to do, David.
Congressman, I'm going to leave you one quick one here because it came from a viewer, and I think it's on a lot of people's mind, which is, this all sounds fine and good, but how do you minimize the effectiveness of the two extremes on the left and the right?
Well, it's by showing results, right? Look, at the end of the day, the work comes from the bottom up. This is why I, as a lawmaker, keep my finger on the pulse of the small businesses, the manufacturing leaders, the educators who are getting the next generation ready for those jobs of the future. And that's the coming together. I serve as the vice chair of the Science Committee. That's a committee that puts out tremendous results. That's what's going to win the day for us, David.
Okay, well, thank you very much for being with us. And once again, congratulations on your victory. That is Haley Stevens. She's Democratic Congresswoman from Michigan. I want you to check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminal and online. Coming up, Balance of Power will continue on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, my colleague Joe Matthew will talk with the new director of DOJ's Klepto Capture Task Force. That's Andrew Adams. And this is Bloomberg.